The mid-game update patch revealed a lot of nice changes coming to the game. The fleshing retier is something that's been needing to happen for a long time, and should help alleviate some of the ammo issues with the mid-game / late-game for ranged. However, even that's not going to be enough. There are still other retierings needing to come, especially with some of the more special weapons, and I hope to see those in the coming future, but this is a very good start. The agility buffs should help alleviate some of the annoyance with getting to 99 agility, at least until, the agility rework inevitably comes out. The buffs to the God Wars dungeon, changing how the kill count works to be more like God Wars Dungeon 2, which is, your kill count is stored every time you leave, up to a maximum of 200. They're really nice. Some people think there should be more changes to God Wars Dungeon. Really, the only thing I think needs to be changed is hard mode needs to actually be a little more rewarding for being the harder version, right? But today I want to talk about one of the bigger problems with mid-game that did not get addressed at all, and that is a lot of the Slayer monster / Slayer drops at that point of the game. A lot of the problems with the Slayer drops in the mid-game is that they come from monsters that are too high of a level for the time to use those weapons, which back in the day made sense. When the game was more PvP focused and functioned a little bit differently stat-wise, those drops were super strong. It made sense, like the Abyssal Demon being 85 to drop the Abyssal Whip, or the Dark Beast being 90 to drop the Dark Bow. But these things haven't really aged well in my opinion. Now some of these, like the Abyssal Whip, compete for so many slots in the modern day that you would also need to find ways to buff that item or certain items like that. But there are also just some items that are just like straight up inaccessible and could very much help with a lot of the level issues at the time, especially in the mid game for magic or even ranged. And sure, the argument can always be made that these things are just outdated content and should never actually be worried about. But even if that's true, they can still fill out niches just as getting lucky drops, right? Even that can help out an account. Like, going back to the Abyssal Whip, you do have more options for tier 70 at the time. Other than being able to make Necronium, you have Barrows, you have the superior, the upgraded dragon weapons, right? You have multiple different options, but imagine if you could get a whip around 70 and you happen to get it, like, around the time you got 70 before you got anything else. You would use it then, right? Well, mainly this is from an iron perspective, I suppose, but even then, a mainscape would probably just keep it or will still sell it inevitably. More or less, this just creates a more consistent loop of gameplay for the game, which I can only see benefits from. Now, there are two ways to go about changing these things and fixing the way to get these drops from said Slayer monsters, and both sides will probably create some form of controversy to it, right? The first and less controversial way is to simply move the drops down to lower tier monsters, or create new monsters of the same kind of general type. So like in the case of Abyssal Demons, instead of demons, it's a new tier 70 something Abyssal monster, right? But the second more controversial way would be to drop the tier of said Slayer monsters. Now, I'm not entirely for that in most cases. Like, it just feels wrong to drop Abyssal Demons down to past, like, below 85, right? But then I look at Dark Beasts and I go, I would actually be okay if those were lower and then were replaced with something higher. I'd be okay with that, but there's certain drops that I think is going to naturally kind of cause some level of nostalgic outrage. Is not really outrage, but you know what I mean, hopefully. But I'd also be worried that would drop down their stats, which would inevitably lead to lower XP on something like Abyssal Demons, which is known for, other than having good drops, having good XP that you can also mob. And then there's always the other kind of Slayer monsters that don't have a Slayer problem, but have an other problem, like Edemus being I think they're 90 Slayer. Maybe that could be dropped a little bit, but the main issue from them is they're the source of blood shards. And they require, I think it's 114 dungeoneering. I will double check that. It's 115, actually. 115 dungeoneering for a mid-game, amulet is kind of crazy. But one thing they can do, in case they ever do want to drop down the level requirements of these Slayer monsters, is they can always replace their Slayer level requirement with a boss version of that. So like, as I said earlier, with Dark Beast being dropped down, they could drop that down between 70 to 75, right? Somewhere in that range. And then at level 90, they can replace it with a Dark Beast Slayer boss. And that would actually kind of make that reward for level 90 still feel good, while giving you a way to get the Dark Bow earlier. And especially since Dark Beasts don't really need to be 90 from like even an XP standpoint. I think that Slayer bosses are something that the community has been wanting to see more of anyways. Kind of like how Old School has Slayer bosses, and they can work in similar like fashions where you need to be on task to kill them. It could even be assigned during Reaper tasks as sort of like shorter tasks for them. And some of these bosses can drop like upgrades to items, or some of them can also still... Actually, no, all of them should still be able to drop whatever item their basic counterpart can at higher rates. But now let's talk about some of those Slayer monsters that have some really annoying to get drops and could be buffed or changed in that regard. I'll go ahead and start with the ones I've already briefly mentioned, starting with the Abyssal Demon. The Demon doesn't just drop whips, it also drops an Abyssal Wand and Orb that came with the OC. And these items are never used because of how hard they are to get, especially for the tier. They're tier 75 coming from tier 85 monsters. That doesn't sound like the worst, but they also have a 1 in 6,000 drop off task and 1 in 3,000 drop on task, so... And that's only for one of them, not both of them. I would propose to drop them down to a new tier, anywhere between 70 to 75 Abyssal monster, maybe a little bit higher, and then replace those drops. Well, not replace, keep those drops on the Abyssal Demon at the rate they're at, but then you can always add something like an upgrade to the Abyssal Wand and the Abyssal Orb to the Abyssal Demon as a way to keep a special unique going that is still thematic to what they used to drop. And basically, all the same can go for the Dark Beast. I really don't have anything else to say about the Dark Beast, other than the fact that the Dark Bow should not drop from a level 90 Slayer monster. Edemus, however, drop the Blood Shard, which is needed to make blood amulets, like the Blood Fury, which, again, insane for 115 Dungeoneering and 90 Slayer. But these things also probably shouldn't be on them to begin with. They realistically should be on something vampiric, like an Old School RuneScape, and with Haven High being such like a prevalent vampiric region, it's all the more opportunity to give us some kind of Vire or vampiric sanguine Slayer monster around that point in the game, and then move that drop there. Ganodermic beasts require 95 Slayer, and the gear you can get out of it, the Polypore Staff and even Ganodermic Armor, are tier 75 gear. These ones especially made sense back in the day. They used to be stupidly meta back in the day, especially for PvP. Now they're completely dead content, and I don't really know why. The armor especially could still be, and is still actually useful to players around that point. It's less useful because most people just buy Subjugation, but then you think about it from an Iron perspective for somebody who maybe wants that little extra hit points. They use Ganodermic. I see people with Ganodermic. Plus, the crafting requirement to make them is also in the 90s, which is crazy. And following the trend of like tier 70 something magic Slayer drops, Ice Strike Worms being 93, I don't have a problem with them being so high, but I have a problem with the Staff of Light being on them. The Staff of Light's a completely dead item, and it probably shouldn't be. It's still not bad. Plus, it can be upgraded into the Staff of Darkness from a drop from the Lava Strike Worms exactly one level later, so that feels really awkward. This staff could actually work really well as a Slayer alternative to God Wars Dungeon 1 gear. Similarly, Glaciors really need an all-around buff to their drops. They don't need any other changes, just a buff to their drops. The boots alone are nearly 1 in 1300 off task and nearly 1 in 700 on task. Like those rates could be tripled and it would still be a rare drop from Glacior specifically. But then you look at the Armadillo Battlestaff shards and they are 1 in 10 to drop and you need 100 to make the orb to make the staff to begin with. And so a 1 in 10 doesn't sound bad, but that is effectively like what? 1,000 Glaciors for a staff? I'm not good at math, somebody correct me if I'm wrong. And yes, the Armadillo Battlestaff is a tier 77, so it competes for slots around that point, like even the Sun Spear. But the Armadillo Battlestaff actually has a really solid spec that is underutilized at that point just because of how annoying it is to get. I would personally buff these to be a 1 in 3 drop. Dinosaurs, actually drop the Bone Blowpipe, which is a tier 50 weapon, funny enough. Level 90 Slayer requirement with, I think it's like a 1 in 1,000 drop rate for a level 50 weapon. Yes, this thing can be upgraded into a tier 88, but this thing is a tier 50 base. Like, I think one of the more obvious solutions would be to just make them drop the full enhanced blowpipe, but I still want to see this tier 50 blowpipe in the game personally. Just move it. It doesn't even have to be a Slayer mob, just move it somewhere to Anachronia, right? But like, why are we still designing, in this day, monsters with stupidly high requirements for stupidly low gear for the time? And now for my last monster I'm going to mention, the Revenants. I think they should be a little bit different from everything I mentioned before. Revenants are currently not an actual Slayer mob. There is like a Slayer requirement for tasks to get them, but there is no requirement to kill any of them. I do think Revenants could and should become a Slayer mob though, and this would allow for better chances at a lot of their drop tables, and they can even split up what drops what. Like maybe alongside some kind of wilderness expansion. They can even make a Revenant Slayer boss, which I think would be cool. Like, imagine a Revenant King Black Dragon or something. As a whole, I feel like Revenant drops, or in general, just Ancient drops, or something I think could use a buff. Revenants are a very popular, like, subcategory of monsters as it is anyways. It just makes sense, given how many different types of Revenants there are, for them to be Slayer monsters. And then, like, have their levels split, like, all across the board. But really, that's all I have for this video. If you liked the video, please leave a like, leave a comment with your ideas and, you know, your thoughts on all of this. But anyways, my name has been Garrett Dimwitz, and will continue to be Garrett Dimwitz, and I'll see you next time.